So the local elections happened in the UK, specifically England, recently, and Reform UK, the insurgent, though no longer self-described populist party, has stormed the board and caused a massive upset. Now, it was predictable for those who knew that Labour was, at the moment, under Keir Starmer, one of the most unpopular governments that the UK has ever had on record, and I am sure that as the re-election results rolled in, Downing Street and Conservative Party headquarters were a bit like Hitler's bunker in Downfall. They had to keep the pistol very much out of reach of Keir Starmer as he saw the numbers of seats that his party and, of course, Kemi Badenoch's were being deducted by Reform UK. So Reform won 10 overall councils and 677 council seats and 2 mayoralties, the new mayoralties of Greater Lincolnshire, that was to Dame Andrea Jenkins, and Hull, that was to a boxer, if I remember correctly, Luke something. Hilarious, I noticed that as soon as Mike Amesbury, the Labour Party MP, who was thrown out of the 16th safest Labour seat, which was Runcorn, for punching a constituent, as soon as he's chucked out for having a dust-up with his constituent, Reform will get a boxer elected up in Hull. So, never say God doesn't have a sense of humour. The Conservatives suffered the worst of all defeats. I think they lost about 44% of all of the defeats of every party in the country. They lost 674 seats, achieving near parity with Reform. They lost 16 councils, and they're down to 0 now that they have under their control. And that's actually a greater percentage share of losses than they suffered at the 2024 general election. It's very telling that only Robert Jenrick's seat in Newham gained councillors. So I wonder, and it's worth talking about later because there's certainly Tory MPs that are making sounds about it, but I wonder if many in CCHQ and the Tory establishment who pulls the strings over there are having buyer's remorse concerning electing Kemi Badenoch as leader and putting her on an easy pathway to it ever since she was elected as an MP in 2017. The Labour Party lost 187 seats, so they're down to 98, and one council. They only had one council under their control. They got no votes at all in 81 council wards, and just 15% of the vote in half of councils. Now, of course, people will chalk this up to being elections being held in more conservative areas, but Labour deliberately intended that certain areas, because they are reorganising their councils into sort of mega councils, they deliberately intended it so that areas like Greater London or Essex did not have local elections occur. And I can tell you now, given how Reform codes as a party, Essex will sweep teal from the Tories, and of course the Red Wall areas largely flipped for Reform from Labour. So the Conservatives are dead in certain areas, and so is Labour. It seems like the two zombies that Peter Hitchens once said are propping each other up as the bodies of the Uniparty. Well, one fell at the last election in 2024, and the other is in the process of falling at the moment. And the first signs of its shadow starting to move towards us was this local election. Peter Hitchens said that and then recommended we vote Tory anyway. Very curious. So it seems that his prediction wasn't borne out in that if you vote for Reform, you'll only ever get Labour. It turns out, if you vote for Reform now, you get Reform. The independent candidates lost 20, so they're down to 89. The Greens gained 44 seats, so they're up to 79. And the Liberal Democrats were also one of the major gainers at 163, so they're up to 370. And they got 3 councils out of this. So what I observed, as I mentioned last week, is that the white English-coded parties are the ones gaining. So Reform UK codes as the populist insurgent party for the dispossessed white working class in the Red Wall and the aspirational working to middle class in outer London and in Essex, the Dinos, right? And they're the ones that have been chased out of their traditional areas by vast numbers of third world migration into the East End of London and broader London, or into northern mill towns, hence the Pakistani Muslim rape scandal. And they're the ones that are also on the precipice of getting a hell of a lot of enrichment by this new plan for installing illegal migrant dispersed accommodation centres funded by Serco in English areas that haven't usually had them. And so the party that codes as white working class, that want to revolt over immigration, for whom 2/3, according to More in Common polling, hold immigration as their paramount issue, were by far the biggest success. And this is why I think a week out from the election, despite running from the prospect of mass deportations, calling them a dark and dangerous use of rhetoric when Rupert Lowe used them, and saying that they're not possible to Stephen Edgington last year, and saying that we can't have amnesty, but we also can't logistically do mass deportations to Winston Marshall last year. I think this is why a week out from the local elections, Nigel Farage got up and gave a press conference saying we're going to deport every single illegal immigrant in the country. It is now our ambition. We'll even appoint a minister for deportations to oversee the process. Again, something I applaud, but something a few weeks ago he would have labelled people as too far to the right to accommodate to reform, or at least say that it's a logistical impossibility and he's not going to get dragged down the route of discussing it. I appreciate the change of mind, and I think that certainly the people within Reform's own base that Adam Wren conducted polling with, where overwhelmingly 99% of them said they want all illegal immigrants deported from the country, the people voting for Reform, members of Reform, expected it, and it's good to see Reform now intending to live up to that promise. Point being, the party that codes as mass deportations, even though they weren't supporting it until a couple of weeks ago, and then the Liberal Democrats, the party which codes as the luxury belief class party, the party that's so anti-political that their leaders' pitch at the last election was to fall off paddleboards and go on Alton Towers rides and completely devolve himself from the political process, the party that complains about Trump like they're boomer Liberal Party in the Anglosphere in Australia or Canada, my commiserations, by the way. The party that does that, but that still codes as the white middle and upper class party in the shires that have hitherto been unmolested by immigration, they're still kind of like Wind in the Willows children's books areas in England, those two parties did the best. The parties of globalization, of mass migration, of calling everyone under the sun far right and saying diversity is our strength, they didn't win. It's the parties promising to ensure that the waters aren't contaminated with sewage, that the hedgerows are still leafy and green, the TikToks and music aren't being played aloud on public transport, and that, in the case of Reform now, all of the illegal migrants and foreign criminals sitting in prison are deported. They did the best. So Farage was correct to say in 2024, this will be the immigration election. And so it'll be interesting to see what Reform actually do when they're governing these councils, because this is now their trial by fire, right? What Reform can do is a number of interesting things. First of all, in the first 100 days, Zia Youssef confirmed on the BBC to Laura Kuenssberg that they're going to be kicking illegal immigrants out of hotels in their districts. And this only happens, by the way, illegal immigrants only get redistributed to certain areas because councils will take money from central government to deploy them in their area, and the councils have had the incentive to do so because lots of local councils have mismanaged their budgets so much that they've been going under. Well, you can do a two-pronged approach to this. First of all, you can empty the hotels of illegal migrants. Andrea Jenkins humorously suggested sticking them in tents in encamped areas, assuming that they're going to be, accelerating their departure from the UK that way. But quite right, I'd rather them stuck in a compound or a disused military barracks with guards watching over them than sitting in a 4-star hotel with free bed and board and healthcare and able to earn, as the Telegraph revealed recently, something we all knew already, £500 a week working for Deliveroo, Just Eats or Uber Eats and paying absolutely no tax and getting discretionary spending subsidies from the taxpayer. They get a bit of pocket money to go spend on JD Sports or in Costa Coffees, just sort of mill about during the daytime while I'm working and paying taxes. No, thank you very much. You can go camping. They can do that. At the same time, they can do a kind of Doge-style audit of council waste. They can, as Farage has tweeted today, refuse to enact costly and racist DEI and climate emergency training at local councils so they can save the taxpayer money and not have the councillors be ideologically brainwashed by a bunch of race grifters and Malthusian sun worshippers. They can also conduct, as was mentioned to me by a senior Reform source, local rape gang inquiries. And if they are Reform councillors, they're more likely to be honest about the racial and religious composition and the aggravation of the gangs and their heinous crimes in their own back gardens. Of course, this isn't every district these have operated in, but there will be some overlap with Reform councils that have been elected to spite Labour in historic Labour-controlled areas where the rape gangs have, of course, operated. And they can refuse central government's subsidies for Operation Scatter, so they can thwart the plans of the Labour government to disperse illegal migrants who will be given taxpayer-funded benefits and eventually a path to citizenship in these areas to try and shore up the Labour vote for generations. A prime example of this, as I tweeted, in Northamptonshire Council last year, during the general election, there was an elderly couple called Josie and Ted Saunders, and before the election, their council had written to them mistakenly, saying their house was derelict and they were going to be forced to sell it because the council was, quote, struggling with a shortage of dispersed accommodation due to a, quote, considerable increase in single male asylum seekers. So they were going to force this elderly couple to sell their home to put Tom, Dick and Abdul, who crossed the channel illegally, broke into the country, up at your and my law-abiding taxpayers' expense. Well, on Friday, at the local election, Reform won 13 council seats, Labour lost 6, and the Conservatives lost 9. It turns out treachery has consequences, and I think Reform's local councillors are going to be more inclined to do some hardline measures than maybe even their central office, who have been determined to tack to the centre in recent weeks before reversing their position on mass deportations. Unfortunately, I believe 6 of these councillors, as I've been told by inside sources, have already been suspended, either for social media posts or one because I think he actually lives in France, so I don't know how he slipped through the vetting process. So it's a shame that before positions have even been taken after the election, that 6 of these councillors, at least, have been suspended pending investigation because they've written things on social media, like relating to Tommy Robinson, for example, that Reform don't necessarily like. And it's also a shame, I must say, that after his undeniable victory, Nigel Farage felt the need, on VE Day, outside Buckingham Palace, on GB News, to take further shots at former MP Rupert Lowe, former Deputy Leader Ben Habib, and the broader right who were concerned that he was softening too much on immigration and loosening the modus operandi of the party.
With all of the furore around Rupert Lowe, people were saying, this is it, this is going to be, this isn't just a dent in the Reform Party, this is going to destroy the Reform Party. And over the weekend, people were saying, Rupert who? Yeah. It doesn't appear to have made any sort of impact, despite the best efforts of Andrew Pearce with his journalistic expertise.
Even though I work here, I'm going to be critical of GB News. GB News covered this story obsessively, as if it was some huge story.
It's all his fault.
And it was never a huge story. It was one person who had increasingly been heading in a different direction from
your chairman made it a big story by calling in the police.
Well, he did do that.
Do you think that was a good idea? Nigel Farage, I'm going to challenge you.
I'll pass on that.
There we are.
I'll pass on that.
It was a bizarre decision for Zia Youssef to call in the police.
But you know, it was only ever going to be one person. And the upshot of this, what it really tells you is that X is not the real world.
Yeah. Correct. You know, Twitter as it was now.
Twitter as it was is not the real world. So, yeah, you know, when you get problems in life, the best thing is to confront them.
Would you have him back now in the party, Rupert Lowe, after all of this? Ben Habib, is there a way back for Ben?
Over my dead body.
Well, he wrote a piece saying you didn't deserve your victory. Did you see it?
I mean, I'm sorry, you get these small, very insignificant people who
say what you think, Nigel.
Who think they're more important than they are. They're frankly nothings. There you are.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, I don't mind people sounding off. I don't mind people disagreeing with me. I never have done. As long as there's some fundamental underlying loyalty. And that's the one thing I demand.
Yeah. You just kept the ship steady, it seemed, as an observer, when all of the headlines were about Rupert Lowe and Ben Habib and whether this was a split in the political right. You just kept your hand on the tiller, it seemed, and you just carried on in that direction towards those local council elections where you've swept the board by any definition and that by-election. Were you confident, Nigel, all the time throughout that process that it was going to go that way?
Of course. Well, I was confident that Rupert Lowe and the alt-right Tommy Robinson supporters on X, you know, weren't much of a benefit to us. I was confident about that. I was confident it was the right thing to do. You know, I knew it would dent us in the short term, but no more than dent us. But, you know, I mean, look at the image of the party now.
Bear in mind, I like Matt Goodwin, nice chap, but he had said that the online right misread the room after Farage announced mass deportations. I think that without pressure applied by, yes, myself as a critical friend and inclined supporter of Reform UK, but also people that were even more critical and had felt the party had betrayed them and let them down and held their vote on the condition that mass deportations and concern about demographic change were reinstated. as statutes of the party. I think without those concerns being expressed, without that pressure being applied on X by the very online right, I don't think we would have got that immigration U-turn, and that I don't think Reform would have listened to the concerns expressed by its base and instead would have continued listening to concerns expressed by a mainstream media that will always call them racist and would rather see the party capsize and collapse than become the next party of government. Listen to concerns made by your friends who want you to win and want you to win in such a fashion that you can govern effectively, rather than the complaints of a media that are trying to hem you into a SW1 bubble and either sabotage your chances of walking into Downing Street in 2029 or make you so indistinguishable to the Uniparty that a victory by you is a victory for them anyway. Now, what's quite interesting is how the other parties have reacted to the rise of Reform. What's happening in the Conservative Party? Well, of course, the Conservative Party are a very jittery bunch, right? Senior Tory sources have told David Maddox at The Independent, at least two senior Tory MPs from the backbench, that they are meeting to plot the ousting of Kemi Badenoch already. Now, she hasn't been in the position for a year. She has to be in the position for the year. And the 1922 committee, which governs the Conservative Party, have even raised the threshold for the number of MPs that need to vote on no confidence to get her out. But they're already plotting ahead of her year in the job to substitute someone else in. They told David Maddox, quote, "We cannot continue as we are, and she's just not up to the task." Another one said, "These results were actually worse than last year's general election. We have somehow gone backwards." Turns out that worshipping a candidate because she's some sort of tough-talking Yoruba auntie who will take no nonsense, and kind of buying into the bullshit veneer of Kemi Badenoch being this door-kicking culture warrior, turns out it didn't pan out. Turns out that selecting explicitly your candidate on the basis of her race and sex and her immigrant heritage at a time where anti-immigration sentiment is rising high because the Conservatives themselves liberalised the immigration system to such an extent that the skilled worker visa had no cap and the salary threshold was set at the minimum wage, and you can bring in limitless numbers of dependents. Turns out that picking an immigrant as your party leader was not a good plan. And it turns out that people on the very online right were saying this to you. It turns out that people actually like Robert Jenrick. They like his policies. They like his attention to detail. They like his concise presentation with these very slick social media videos. They like the fact that he is taking the fight to the government as a kind of one-man opposition movement, single-handedly almost thwarting the two-tier sentencing guidance that was going to be rushed through, that would have incarcerated white men at higher rates than demographics that are more likely to commit certain types of violent crime, like transgender or black or Muslim individuals. So it seems like, judging by the fact that Newham was the only place where Tories made gains, Robert Jenrick would have been the smarter choice. Don't worry, though, ladies and gents. CCHQ are never ones to learn from their mistakes because they're lining up James Cleverly to take over instead. You know, the Home Secretary, so poorly named that he, again, oversaw an increase in immigration and then tried to fight the Conservatives' election campaign on saying Labour are going to raise immigration. Also, look, James Cleverly has a squeaky clean veneer, even if he is a bumbling idiot with no credibility on his key issue of immigration serving at the Home Office. However, I have no doubt that if he is a CCHQ favourite, because the Conservative Party is basically a blackmail ring with a party attached, right? According to its own chief whip's latest book, I have no doubt that eventually a skeleton will come rattling out of some closet ahead of his leadership bid. So the Conservatives would be smart to pick Robert Jenrick, and it would be advantageous to Reform supporters, actually, because you'd have a sort of mutually reinforcing right-wing arms race. It would stop Reform from getting complacent. It would show, as the Conservatives campaigned in the late days of the local elections, on the fact that Nigel Farage had once said that he didn't want mass deportations, and using clips from his interview with Stephen Edgington, it shows that the direction of political travel, or the momentum, is with immigration skepticism, is with deporting illegal migrants, is with upholding the law, you know, as we used to do in a proper country that we were. And so if Robert Jenrick were the leader, it would be healthier for both parties, even if the Conservatives have absolutely no hope in hell of ever winning back the trust of all the constituencies and the public that they have betrayed with the Boris Wade, with lockdown, with things like entrenching Blair's constitutional and cultural revolution with things like the Equalities Act, or with the two-tier policing, with the non-crime hate incidents. All of these things the Conservatives did that are unforgivable. Even if they can't win voters back, it would still be healthier for politics as a whole for Robert Jenrick to replace Kemi Badenoch. And again, things are being moved in that direction. One Tory MP told The Telegraph, "I think the leader needs to go. I think she's lost the plot. She's not good enough, and I think the people around her aren't good enough either. There's no vision at the moment, and there's no leadership. We've allowed a void to open up, and Nigel Farage has been able to move into it." So some are seeing their rightward flank totally open, and Reform, even if they're not as patriotic, populist, and immigration skeptic as the British public themselves are, Reform are occupying that space. They code that way. However, again, Tories unlikely to learn their lesson, because one Conservative strategist also told The Telegraph, "I think," and this is mental, that they think because Pierre Poilievre and Peter Dutton just lost in Canada and Australia, this shows the danger of chasing populist parties like Reform to the right. If you think that Peter Dutton and Pierre Poilievre lost because they were too right-wing, you are genuinely beyond help. Check yourself into a sanatorium, right? They lost because Canada and Australia are demographically, politically, economically, and culturally at least 5 years behind the UK. Because the allegation here is that, by the likes of William Hague, for example, in the Times, and as Liz Truss quipped, if you want to learn how to win an election, do the opposite of what William Hague advises you to do. But the likes of William Hague that suggest that being a right-wing populist party, or a centre-right party as he likes to define himself, and being wedded to Trump is a liability for the electorate, especially in Britain and the Anglosphere. Anyone suggesting that has not reckoned with the fact that Reform codes as Britain's MAGA movement, that Farage codes as Britain's Trump and is currently the most popular party leader in the country and the most likely to become the Prime Minister as of 2029. Hating Trump is a luxury belief. Things in the country, in Britain, have gotten so bad now that actually people are prioritising just the guy who might be boisterous and unpopular coming in and fixing the issues. We are living through the UKification of everything, as Cunley Drugpa and now Luca Watson in The Critic have coined. A kind of transformation of our country into an impoverished, aesthetically ugly dystopia. But not the dystopia we ordered. It's not Blade Runner, right? It's like Blade Runner, but if all the adverts had hijabs in them rather than geishas. And there's also a kind of global monoculture emerging, which is a mix of JD sports apparel, violent crime and honor culture, and gibberish patois. Like, if someone can make a case for why diversity and multiculturalism is such a benefit that the incomprehensible word leng has entered the English lexicon, I'm welcome to hear it, but it's unlikely going to be convincing to the majority of people that have got to live with it. And so, if you want to make anti-Trumpism the flagship policy of a rejuvenated Conservative Party, and you think that's going to see off Reform, go ahead. If you think that not being squishy enough was why Peter Dutton and why Pierre Poilievre lost in Australia and Canada, then you genuinely can never recover from the electorally irrelevant ditch that you have put the Conservatives in. They will be irrelevant for all time. And of course, William Hague did the usual Blairite thing, because he was meant to be leader of the opposition against Blair, but said that, of course, ID cards are the solution to every problem, including migration. It was interesting, though, that he said in another column for The Times that the way the Conservatives can get back is play into the cross-party consensus across Europe of scepticism for migration, because he said that there needs to be a zero refugee policy as the Danes had instituted. Very interesting that he's gone from 2023, where even right-wingers need migration, to zero refugee policy. You can see where the momentum is travelling. But look, if they think that Kemi Badenoch or James Cleverly as her successor is a winning political strategy, yeah, they've got another thing coming.